as we begin to investigate how taxes affect the market, we need to distinguish between the legal incidence of the tax and the real incidence. Oftentimes, when we think about taxes, people mistakenly think that the legal incidence is important. In other words, who is legally responsible for paying the tax? Turns out that the legal incidence of the tax doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter whether we tax consumers of apples or producers of apples. The outcome will be the same. To see that, we're going to go through this example without numbers, but just conceptually showing the impact of a tax placed on producers and placed on consumers. But again, the conclusion is that the real impact on the market, on different groups within the market, is the same regardless of the legal incidence. So the legal incidence of the tax, who is being taxed, does not affect the real incidence. Incidence means like who bears the burden of the tax, who is paying the tax. And so the legal incidence, who's legally paying the tax, who's actually handing the money to the government, does not affect whose pocket that money really comes out of. Okay, so we're going to see that here on these graphs as we draw the impact of the tax placed on producers on one and placed on consumers on the other. So we're going to just imagine that this is the same tax, and you can see that I've given you this tax wedge, right? The impact of the tax is that it drives a wedge or a difference in between the price for the consumer and the price for the firm. And I've gone ahead and placed that on our graph so that we can make sure we're comparing apples to apples. In other words, we have the same tax on each graph. Okay, so let's think about how a tax placed on producers of apples would affect the market. So now, every time I sell an apple, I not only have to pay the cost of production, but I also have to pay the tax to the government. So in some sense, the cost of producing and selling an apple has increased. This will shift supply up vertically, not up, right? But up vertically by the amount of the tax, because remember that supply represents the cost of production. So as the cost of production increases, my supply curve will shift. So your new supply curve here will be equal to the old supply curve plus the amount of the tax, right? My new production cost is equal to my old production cost, plus now I also have to pay this tax to the government. And so you can see the impact of that. Remember that the height of this line here, that's the amount of the tax. So what I'm doing is I'm shifting the supply curve vertically up by the amount of the tax, which you can see is equivalent to a decrease in supply, right? I'm willing to supply less, a lower quantity now, right? It's an inward shift of the supply curve because what's happening is that my production costs have increased. It's less profitable to produce, and so I will be producing less, right? And charging higher price. Okay, so we shift the supply curve up vertically by the amount of the tax. And of course, then we have a new equilibrium point here. And the equilibrium point where supply and demand intersect, that's the amount of money exchanged between the consumer and the producer. So that's going to be the price that the consumer pays. But of course, it's not the amount of money the firm gets to keep, right? The firm has to give part of that to the government. And we know exactly how much. They have to give this amount to the government. And so the price that the firm actually gets to keep is given by this point down here. So here we have PC, and PF are two new prices in this market. And then, of course, this will be the new quantity. So you can see that we sell a lower quantity of the good. The price for the consumer has increased, as this is our old equilibrium price with no tax, right? And our old equilibrium quantity. So the price for the consumer has gone up, the price for the firm has gone down, and the overall quantity has decreased. All right, so this is the picture of the impact of a tax placed on the production of a product. Now we want to look at the same tax, but instead of taxing producers, we're going to be taxing consumers. If we're taxing consumers, it means that when I go out and buy an apple, I give some money to the firm, but I'm also going to owe some money to the government, right? So I'm legally responsible for giving the money to the government as the consumer. Then I not only have to pay the firm, but I also have to pay the government. All right, so my cost of consumption has gone up here, right? Which means that demand is going to shift in, right? It's more costly, so I'm going to buy less. In other words, my willingness to pay to the firm is going to be lower, and it's going to be lower by the amount of the tax. So when we place a tax on consumers, our new demand equation is going to be equal to our old demand equation minus the amount of the tax. So we're going to shift demand, and we're going to shift demand down vertically by the amount of the tax. Remember, demand represents the benefit of the product to me, or how much I'm willing to pay for this product. And now I'm willing to pay a smaller amount to the producer because I know I also have to pay the government. Okay, so again, we're going to use this tax wedge as a guide for shifting our demand curve down vertically by the amount of the tax, and that is a decrease in demand here. And we get this new equilibrium point. Okay, here's our old quantity and our new quantity. And so here we have our new equilibrium point. That, again, that's the amount of money that is exchanged between the consumer and the producer. So in this case, it's the price the firms get to keep, because the consumer gives money to the firm's fine, they have no tax, but then the consumer also has to give money to the government. So the price that the consumer pays, right, we're using this equation now here, is equal to the price the firm gets to keep plus the amount of the tax, which of course that's represented by this distance, this wedge here. Okay, so then we see again the same impact on this market, whether or not we're shifting supply down or shifting supply up vertically by the amount of the tax, or shifting demand down vertically by the amount of the tax. The impact is the same. The price for consumers goes up, the price for the firms goes down, and the quantity in the market decreases. So the big takeaway here is that the legal incidence does not matter, right? If I say, oh, those terrible oil companies, they make huge amounts of profit, why don't we just tax them, right? We also have to recognize that by taxing oil, even if we place the tax on producers, we're also taxing consumers of oil, right? Because part of the money that pays for the tax comes from the consumers as their price increases. And maybe we don't want to increase the price of gasoline. Maybe that's regressive, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. But in other words, maybe it falls more heavily on low-income households. So just because we see those big oil companies making tons of money, it doesn't necessarily mean that a tax on the production of oil would achieve the desired outcome it may just be passed along to consumers of oil. All right, so we're going to investigate that all more as we go through this module, but this is the meat of what we're doing, and we've set ourselves up here for a nice number example in the next video.